Hey everyone, welcome to Taking the Pulse, a healthcare and life sciences video podcast. I am Heather Hoops Matthews here with Maynard Nexon healthcare attorney Matthew Roberts. Matthew, good to be with you.
Good to see you.
We are coming to you live from SCbio's annual conference in Greenville, South Carolina this year. This is one of the premier life sciences experiences in the Southeast, bringing together cutting edge presentations and really regional and national life sciences leaders. And we're joined in this episode by Scott Pancoast. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thank you all. It's great to be here.
You are the founder and CEO of Zylo Therapeutics. You offer an innovative drug delivery system, encapsulation technology, but really your background is interesting in that you have a passion and a long time track record in life sciences. You've helped companies from the startup get going on your time on the West Coast, and now you're here in South Carolina. Tell us first just a little bit about your background and your interest in life sciences. And then we want to hear more about this.
Okay. Yeah, so, I'm an MBA type. I'm not a scientist. I pretend to be one at times. But after the first 15 years of my career, I got offered a job in San Diego working for a very wealthy family that had just sold the first ear thermometer company to American Home Products, which was then, very shortly thereafter, bought by Pfizer. So the family's now worth $100 and some million, and the patriarch of the family, all of 45 years old at the time, was ready to retire. So he hired me and said, Scott, do more of that. So I then got immersed in the venture capital industry, which was beginning to flourish at that time in San Diego. In fact, I became head of the San Diego Venture Group, and that's a whole different story. But so I was told to invest in San Diego. The family loved San Diego and said, we want to kind of give back. So I started to invest in startups ranging from RFID, radio frequency ID, technology to software systems for inmates and a variety of other very interesting technologies, but about a third of them were life science. And I was then kind of forced to start learn about physiology, biology, and cellular pathways and all that. So a turning point was when Professor Roger Sabadini walked into my office. He had a startup out of San Diego State University, and he and I hit it off. He's a charming individual, and we ended up investing in his startup. It's called LPath, and it related to monoclonal antibodies. And that began a 15-year relationship with him and with LPath. It struggled for a while. I was like the executive chairman because Roger didn't have a business bone in his body. So as it struggled, I'm kind of helping on the business side. And then he had his eureka moment, at which point, the company hit a key milestone. We needed to find a full-time CEO. We looked, and no one was quite right. Roger's a little picky. So he said, Scott, why don't you become the CEO? Because I'd had some management experience running companies. So I thought about it and said, yeah, I prefer running companies over watching them being run. When you're a board member, you just watch.
Right.
And keep an eye on the CEO type of thing. So I transitioned with the family, took over LPath. We, about a year later, had brought up a business plan that I liked, slide deck. We raised $8 million.
Wow, okay.
We took it public.
Wow.
In the next 3 years, we forged worldwide partnerships with the likes of Pfizer, Biogen, Merck Serono, J&J, and we were off to the races. And so it was, another 9 years later, the company had a bit of a stumble in a phase 2 study. Pfizer pulled out, and I was heading to Greenville to retire.
Yes.
It didn't work out that way, but anyway, it was a nice run. I learned a ton from Roger. He's a teacher at heart. Some professors aren't so good at teaching. He was phenomenal. And I learned a bunch about not only biology, but about how life sciences works at the public company level as well.
Yes.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the life cycle of a life sciences company, coming from startup where there's an idea and then you get some funding and then you grow it and maybe more funding and maybe you go public, maybe you sell. Talk a little bit about that, because there's some uniqueness in the life science industry because of the technology involved.
There is a lot of uniqueness, as you say. A lot of companies, we'll get into that in a second, but a lot of companies, you can sell a company for $1 billion in the life science world without a single dollar of revenue. In fact, you might be 3 to 4 years away from the first dollar of revenue. But it starts out usually with a novel idea, some technological innovation, typically from a research institution, be it a university or something like Scripps Research Institute or Salk or whatever. There's a bunch of those. It then usually that idea turns into a grant. That's phase 1 NIH grant, then a phase 2 NIH grant, which you're talking about some real money here, real money being $1.5 million, $2 million. And then the scientists involved make a critical decision. Do we want to break off and actually start a company? Which is a major event, because typically these companies need somewhere between $20 and $200 million to get to the end point. So they'll begin that journey. That journey involves 7 to 15 years of testing. You start off with, first you have to optimize your drug candidate and declare a true candidate, because there's all sorts of optimization that goes on. So you now have a drug candidate. You got to do animal testing for efficacy, animal testing for toxicology. You then have to file an investigational new drug application with the FDA, which is usually 15,000 pages, and involves chemistry, manufacturing, controls. Then you begin the human testing, which can be a 4 to 10 year process, and many tens of millions of dollars. So it's a lot of risk. After you declare a drug, a final candidate, that is your drug candidate, your odds of being FDA approved is probably about 3%.
Wow.
And it's, as I said, many tens of millions of dollars. So the reason you do this is because the upside is so great. You oftentimes can sell the company after your phase 2 clinical trial. So you got to have a phase 3, which is much bigger and robust, more statistically significant. But after your phase 2, you have shown that it's not only safe, or has a low toxicity profile, but it also works. And oftentimes companies get acquired then, or they'll go public via an IPO where they can monetize, the shareholders can get out, if you will. And the numbers are staggering. Sometimes you can get sold after a phase 2 for 10 times what your expected revenues are 5 to 8 years hence. So it's just crazy formula.
There's the upside. There's the gold ring.
So Innova, the guy who runs Innova out of MUSC, Charleston area, his former company did that very thing. And they sold for $1 billion after phase 2 results. So the upside's huge.
Huge. Is that the process that you had to go through for your encapsulation?
Well, no. See, so ours is a platform delivery technology. Now, we've gotten a bunch of NIH grants and a DoD grant on programs for wound healing, for erectile dysfunction, for lupus, cutaneous lupus. So any one of those programs, in order to be commercialized, would have to. They'd have to file an IND. They'd have to go through phase 1, phase 2, after animal testing. So it's an arduous process. We, Zylo, are about to spin out our pharma programs, because it takes a different type of investor who's willing to go down that torturous path, willing to put in a bunch of money, and willing to take on that risk. So it's a different type of investor and a different type of acquirer. So for a lot of those reasons, we are choosing to split between the non-pharma and the pharma side.
Yeah.
Two quick things. One, how do you prepare yourself for that arduous path? And then before we run out of time, would you explain how your encapsulation process works?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for scientists who have gotten a couple of NIH grants and thinking about starting a company, surround yourself with a lot of smart people, smart lawyers, smart accountants. Probably lawyers are more important. Sorry, you accountants out there. And advisors, scientific advisors. You should draw up a business plan. Google what is required in a business plan and follow that template. It's fairly easy. That will define what is needed, what resources are needed, what your timeline is, your key milestones, et cetera. And then decide whether you're up for it and whether you have a durable competitive advantage. It's easy to get misguided because the NIH is a lower bar than the VCs will be. I can guarantee you that.
Very true.
And so it is an arduous process, and it's a roller coaster ride. It's filled with navigating risks. You have no visibility early on more than a couple months out. Even 4 years out, you might not have visibility beyond 6 months. So be prepared, surround yourself with good people, and think about hiring a CEO who's already done it. And you as a scientist take on the chief scientific officer role.
I'm not sure I have the stomach for it.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's not for the weak of heart.
It is not.
So tell us about Zylo.
So Zylo, it's a drug delivery platform. It uses silica as its delivery system. So we make a fine powder. And in the powder are all these pores where the payload resides. So we actually load or encapsulate a payload into our little silica particles. At the end of the day, we enhance bioavailability, which is the holy grail for a lot of drugs, because the body resists taking on a lot of drug. So if you can optimize bioavailability, you'll either end up with better efficacy with the same amount of drug or same efficacy with a lot less drug. In either case, it's a good equation, a good formula for success. And another way to look at our technology is its sustained release. So you got all sorts of sustained release for oral meds, but for topicals, you really don't. So think about retinol for people who use that for anti-aging. Instead of battling the aging process an hour a day, which is what you're going to get with retinol by itself, think about battling it 24/7, because you'll get sustained release from our particles, all day long, plus minus.
Right.
So
and the compatibility of the delivery system with whatever else you're going to put in it, do you have to do testing on that, or is it pretty much compatible with everything?
We can load, we kind of know what we can load. Any small molecule, for the most part, we can load. If you get into large proteins that need to fold properly in order to function the normal way, those are too big. But for the most part, we can load and get sustained release with anything. But to see whether that makes a difference, that needs to be tested. Does it really improve efficacy at the end of the day? So yes.
One of the things that makes your background so interesting is you've served on multiple boards, still serve on multiple boards. And there's a certain mindset that a board member must have, and there's certain duties that we know. But talk a little bit about what you've learned about being a board member, particularly being a board member of a life sciences company, and how you have to set up your mind to ask certain questions of management to make sure that the company's doing well.
I have served on 18, 19 boards. And I mentioned this before, as a board member, you got to get used to watching the company being run. Don't try to run the company. And that leads me to the number one role of a board. It is to make sure you have the right CEO in place. That's your big job. And if you don't trust the CEO you have in place, time to replace him or her. You have to have inherent trust that they are giving the board his or her version of reality. And it doesn't mean, looking at the world through, rose-colored glasses. Give the board reality. If you are not sharing your problems with the board, you're not being a good CEO. You've got to share the problems with your board, and this is how our team is going to overcome those issues. Okay, so that's number one: is make sure you have the right CEO in place, and if you do that well, you're doing your job. You also should make sure the proper controls are in place. A lot of boards go awry. You hear about all these stories all the time. So you got to have, financial controls. You have to have quality controls. You have to have human resource people control.
Right.
Okay. The CEO is not allowed to fire anyone when he or she wants. Why is that? Because you get in trouble that way.
Right.
You need a two-person system to terminate anybody,
right.
CEO and board, or vice president and CEO. So those are the kind of controls you need in place. And then the board should act as a resource, right? Connecting to the rainmaker lawyer that can do this for you, connecting to the right scientific advisors, being a sounding board for the CEO, to listen to the CEO, work through the problems that will invariably exist, and working with the CEO on an exit. Exits are tough.
What's your thought on the independent board members? You hear a lot of corporate governance stories, and we deal with this occasionally. Boards are hand selected by certain people, and you sometimes lose independence when it's a sort of set of friends of one or more.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? What's your experience been?
It is a fine balance. CEOs will naturally cling to, I'm hiring my friends as board members because things won't spiral out of control. But it's typically a mistake. I happen to have a good enough and robust enough set of friends that I was able to find a couple that I started off with. One's a 70-year-old Harvard MBA, and the other one is a 70-year-old guy who's been a CFO and CEO in life sciences for 28 years. Okay. So that was a good starting point, but we eventually ended up with an independent person as well. So the friends, if you're going to do friends, make sure they really qualify for a board seat.
Right.
Don't waste board seats. But it's always good eventually, first couple of years you don't need to do it, but eventually throw in a independent person, spend some time with that person, make sure they are a good fit, make sure they're not a know-it-all. The worst board members are the know-it-alls who dominate the conversation, and it's kind of their way or the highway. And if you find out that one board member is doing most of the talking, you got to change the dynamic there.
Right.
So that's my take
That's
on
good.
it.
That's
good
honest, good,
That's really good
right?
advice.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Scott Pancoast, founder and CEO of Zylo Therapeutics. We are glad to have you in South Carolina.
It's great to be
glad
here.
to have you as part of SCbio. Thank you for joining us on the Pulse today.
Again, thank you all for what you all do. Appreciate it.
Thank you. For those of you who joined us today on Taking the Pulse, we hope you enjoyed this episode and that if you're interested, you get involved with SCbio. Again, we're here in Greenville, South Carolina at their annual large conference. It's very dynamic and a lot going on. On behalf of Matthew and the whole team, we look forward to seeing you next time right here on Taking the Pulse, a healthcare and life sciences video podcast.